Good morning. I'm Katrina Scales. I'm a producer here at News 6, as well as the host of the Your Florida Daily podcast. Thank you so much for joining us here on News 6 Plus, on clickorlando.com, and on YouTube. We are live with a fascinating conversation about some new research about Florida's manatees. I am joined by Dr. David Thulman, adjunct professor at George Washington University, as well as Dr. Tom Pluckhahn, professor of anthropology at the University of South Florida. So 2 universities, one of which has a lot of snow on the ground. Dr. Thulman, I'm really glad you could join us. We're very comfortable down here in Florida despite some relatively cool temperatures. Sorry to rub it in. But I think both of you have really fascinating work in your pocket now about Florida's manatee population, and that, despite Florida's having a pretty rough time over the last few years, we've seen manatee die-offs, we've seen a lot of existential threats to the species. The population has been recorded with numbers higher than ever, and I think that might come as a surprise to people because manatees are so historically ingrained in our culture. In fact, they're the state mammal of Florida since 1975. So we love them. They're gentle. They're a big part of Florida culture, but they haven't always been here. And when they arrived in large numbers, might raise some eyebrows, which is the core of your research that you both put in a published bit of an article that came out just a couple of months ago. And I want to talk about when manatees first arrived in large numbers. We're talking about the pre-colonial era. Can we first talk about when that piece of history was and when we actually started seeing the species move into the peninsula in larger numbers? David, I'll start with you.
Well, it's a difficult question to answer, and in large part because it depends on how people reported that information. And as the article goes through in quite a lot of detail, that's dependent on early colonial explorers reporting that they saw these weird mammals, because these mammals are not around in England or in Europe, so nobody would really know what they looked like or what they, how to describe them. And so we have to go back through early records and try to figure out what people were talking about, and then extrapolate from those occasional sightings and even less often reporting of those sightings as to how common they were. And as the article points out, they're very sporadically reported, and sometimes it's unclear whether they're talking about seals or whales or manatees.
And we look at archaeological bones, fossils, often to really understand when a species was around, was abundant, if those fossils were turned into tools by Native Americans. Florida has a very segmented history. Various native tribes been here for something like 14,000 years. We've had French colonists, Spanish colonists, British colonists, and then Florida became a state in 1800s. So we have all these segments of history, but we didn't really see the manatee, archaeological footprint until much later. Can we explain why that was? I mean, what was going on with Florida's environment that made it maybe not as nice for manatees to stick around? Tom, I'll put that question to you.
Sure. So it would be a little bit of an overstatement to say that they weren't around at all. But what we can say for sure is they're really sparsely represented in the archaeological record. And you're correct that people have been in Florida for 14,000 years. And manatees, or the ancestors of manatees, the Sirenians that predate the Florida manatee, were in Florida millions of years ago when the state was underwater. So we do find Sirenian fossils, and native peoples of Florida and early settlers picked up those fossils, but the actual bones of manatees are extremely uncommon on archaeological sites. But we do have 1 or 2 examples dating back as far as 5,000 years ago. But they must have been, or it seems likely that they were pretty uncommon in Florida.
And talk about why that is. What changed in the 18th, 19th century when we started seeing more bones, fossils, evidence of them in large numbers, specifically inland into Florida Springs?
Well, there are a couple factors. First of all, the climate is much warmer than it has been in the past. Part of that is natural climate change. Beginning about 1200 AD and continuing into the 1800s, we were in what's called the Little Ice Age, and we don't know the precise effects. And it was probably not, continuously cold, but there are studies of fossil corals that suggest that winter water temperatures were colder, and there are historical records that suggest it was also colder too. And of course, anthropogenic climate change has started since the 1800s and has warmed the waters as well. So that's been a big factor, we think. And then,
Doctor,
of course,
go ahead.
oh, sorry. Oh, I was going to add, protections for manatees have contributed, and then just other changes to the Florida landscape.
Yeah, it's worth noting that for almost 50 years, manatees were considered an endangered species, and it was only since 2017 that they were put on the threatened list. So their numbers have rebounded remarkably, even though we do see a lot of stories about the strife of boat strikes and cold stress, especially this time of year when they're flocking into the springs when their food source is scarce. Something that I found so fascinating about this article was we talked about climate change a little bit and the habits of the migration of manatees. Coal plants on the coastline warming up waters. I mean, I grew up in the Titusville area, and I long time would go to the Barge Canal and to the Indian River there, and they would all kind of migrate up to the warm water that's being put out by the power plants there. That was a big part of their move into Florida as well. Dave, I'll put that question to you because we saw quite a large population growth into the 1920s and into the industrial era. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. And it's a couple of factors. One is that so manatees are limited by water temperature during the winter. If it's too cold in the winter, they'll migrate south or just won't survive over winter. And so once those warm water refugia kick in, they have places where they will go and congregate and can survive the cold water over winter, or the cold weather over winter. And the second factor is an increase in forage plants. And so they usually, I think, originally would just be feeding on the Florida eelgrass, is what it's commonly known as, which you see in a lot of rivers. But once these invasive plants came through in hydrilla and water hyacinth, manatees love to eat those too. And so those are also present when modern Americans came in, and sometimes they purposefully planted those plants. And as any typical invasive species, they started invading and they reproduced a lot. So not only did manatees have protection from the cold water, these invasive species were able to support larger populations. So I think those two factors coming together as Florida becomes more and more populated and more industrialized lead to this growth in manatee population.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to Dr. David Thulman. He is an adjunct professor at George Washington University, and Dr. Tom Pluckhahn. He is a professor of anthropology at the University of South Florida. We are talking about manatee populations in Florida. How long have they been here, and why that number might not be as large as you think. They are a bit more of a recent species, but you can't quite call them snowbirds. And Dave, we were talking a little bit about this before we started the interview. They are attracted to warm water. That's what they thrive in. Their food source thrives in, and then just temperamentally that they exist in warmer bodies of water. So what is the future of management of this species. We are seeing population, rebounding and doing well despite, existential threats to the species due to man-made reasons. I just think that this research really plays into assumptions about a species' place in Florida history and why we can't just assume. We really have to dig deep into the science. So what do you think this research is going to do for the future of managing the species in Florida?
Well, I hope it'll stimulate managers and people who are responsible for managing the populations and ensuring their survival to think about what these limiting factors we've talked about, and we're not the only ones to have talked about them, but they clearly, in our mind, are the key indicators or key problems that need to be addressed. So as you start to remove warm water sources, you need to come up with some way to sort of replace those or supplement so the manatees can survive through the winter. And the same with food sources. It seems maybe unsupportable in the long term to keep throwing iceberg lettuce into the water, but how that occurs is a really tough question, I think. We don't come up with great solutions, I think, in the paper, but that's not really our expertise.
Sure. You just lay out the science. We got to have FWC and others step up to really make the changes here. But what I'm hearing you say is a long-term plan is what's needed here. Maybe not heads of lettuce, a little bit more of a better understanding of their place here and how to sustain the species in ways that involve human action that have long-term implications. I have a question from YouTube here. We're streaming live on YouTube as well as clickorlando.com and on News 6 Plus. This question says, how much do we still not know about manatees? Are there still any mysteries to their anatomy? And I think this question brings up something because there's actually two subspecies of manatees we're talking about here. There's not just manatees. Tom, I'd love for you to maybe shed a little light on this for someone who is unfamiliar with the two subspecies and the kinds of animals we're talking about.
Yeah, the Florida manatee is a subspecies of the West Indian manatee, and it's been recognized for a while. But there is travel back and forth from Florida to Cuba. Florida manatees have been documented going back to Cuba and vice versa. So there is some mixture there. I do think that our research does kind of raise some questions about, subpopulations of manatees, how long they've been around, what the genetic diversity means. So I'm looking forward to, this research stimulating more research on the population histories of manatees in finer grained detail.
Well, I want to wrap up this interview with maybe too vague or too general of a question for scientists like yourself, but in media we like to draw these big conclusions out of science, but I want to be able to answer this question when people ask me or when people see this story. Are manatees native to Florida, and should we be protecting them? It's for both of you.
I'd say they're clearly native to Florida. It's just that their numbers are greater now and their habitat has changed so that Florida is a much more inviting place for manatees than it ever was in the past. And that, yes, it's an iconic species for Florida, and we should do what we can to protect it and enhance it and keep it around for a long time. They're great.
Tom?
Yeah, I think Dave and I both, I think I can speak for Dave in saying that we also love manatees, and we want to see them protected. And we don't want this research to be used to argue that they can't be sustained in these numbers. But it's going to take some planning. I like to say it's kind of like, and to a certain extent, it's sort of like a dog or a cat followed us home and had a litter of kittens. I think we feel responsible for them now. Yeah, absolutely. We love manatees, and we hope this research can actually, help conserve manatees.
Well, thank you both so much for this conversation. I think it was fascinating. That was Dr. David Thulman. He is an adjunct professor at George Washington University, and Dr. Tom Pluckhahn, anthropology professor at the University of South Florida. We were talking about newly published research about historical manatee populations in Florida and the lack of archaeological evidence of their presence in Florida's pre-colonial era. Fascinating conversation. We'll obviously bring this conversation to life on clickorlando.com in an article, as well as this afternoon at News 6 at 4:30. Coming up around 4:45, we'll represent this interview in a new way and really dive deep into this topic. Thank you all so much for joining us here on clickorlando.com, YouTube, and News 6 Plus. I'm Katrina Scales. Appreciate you watching. See you next time.